This is a podcast by the Straits Times.
Hello, I'm Lynda Hong, Assistant Podcast Editor of the Straits Times. You're listening to In Your Opinion, a podcast series that takes a hard look at social issues of the day. From April to June, electricity and household tariffs are going up. And we've been warned to brace for even higher utility bills after this quarter as the ongoing war in the Middle East squeezes global fuel supplies. But this always leads to a very common question from Singaporeans. To counter these exact types of supply shocks, Singapore actually has enough national fuel reserves to last us for months. So if we have our own stockpiles, why do we still need to pay for more? To unpack this, I'm joined by energy economist David Broadstock, a partner at the energy industry consultancy, the Lantau Group. Welcome to the show, David.
Thank you, Lynda. Happy to be here.
So, David, first of all, whenever there's a global energy crisis, the government assures us we have months of fuel reserves. So why do our electricity bills and pump prices still spike so quickly? Maybe you can explain the fundamental difference between physical supply security and price immunity.
It's a very complicated landscape, to be very honest. We have to just pause, slow down and appreciate the multiple things which exist within the market context. Physical supply of fuel is important to the economy. Everything we do requires energy, whether it's going to work or going to the hospital, going to schools. There's not a thing we do that doesn't use energy. And for this reason, energy itself is of strategic importance to the economy. And every economy, this is not a new practice, it's not a local practice, but every economy has a strategic reserve of fuels. And standard practice is that this will normally be in the region of a few months' worth of supply. 2 or 3 months worth of fuel that will allow the economy to continue to operate despite what other conditions may be in place. And this is the physical supply resilience which all economies worldwide require. And this is one thing which we refer to. What we're facing today is a fascinatingly complex problem. We're not in the territory of a traditional shock to oil and gas markets like we've seen in recent years. And we've seen a few big ones. But what we saw with COVID was that demand was impacted, but the supply equipment for the fuel systems didn't change. If we think about Russia-Ukraine crisis, the impacts that had on the global energy markets, especially on gas markets, we again saw economic and political changes towards the supply chain, but it wasn't the equipment. If we go way back to the 1970s and everything in between, we see governments and particularly OPEC producers think about how to modify the supply of fuels in order to drive the price to places that they are comfortable with so that they can sustain their own economies. And again, we didn't really see physical disruptions to the supply chain. Now, what we have with this particular conflict is something quite different. We have the underlying facilities that produce the oil and gas and ship them out being damaged to a point that we cannot predict whether it's going to be months or years that we have to wait. So the narratives surrounding this crisis, they really differ. And when we hear conversations around reminding society that we have a physical availability of fuel, therefore we need not panic, they really are talking towards that edge of this story. That we are facing challenging economic conditions. Prices for fuels are going to go up. Availability of fuel may get harder. And that will have one impact on prices. We don't necessarily have price immunity because the way that prices are created, especially for the tail end, the electricity consumer, those prices are created on a combination of purchases of fuel supplies by retailers and generators that includes some long-term agreements, as well as some fuel which is coming off of the market at the price which is available today. So when we see today's prices spiking, a percentage of that can impact upon our current electricity prices. And we've seen that within the local market.
But we do have reserves. We're told that we have months of reserves. So why does that not protect us from price increases?
That's a very good question. Again, the physical strategic reserves, which have always existed in the economy, they're one thing which exist for physical continuity of the economy. And it's not easy for any government in such a condition to turn around and say, well, let me release that so that the companies in my economy don't suffer financial losses. That shouldn't necessarily be the primary reason. It can be for that if conditions get quite deep and involved, but it really needs to be there so that if you really run out of energy, people can still do things like seek medical care and, essential things that keep people alive and going. That food can be distributed through the economy and all of these things. But in the context of Singapore, on the back end of the crisis which we faced in 2021, 2022, the market shakeout and everything getting disrupted because of the gas price spikes at that time, we also took steps to introduce additional hedging and strategic standby LNG reserves within the economy. And these are a form of reserves which sit somewhere in between. These are reserves which the government helped make available so that electricity generators can, if necessary, draw down fuel from a centralized resource in order to avoid facing high price spikes in the real-time energy markets, so the gas prices or the oil prices that are moving rapidly at the moment. And so within Singapore's context, we actually have two ways in which we think about these reserves. One, which is a set of reserves that is weeks to months long that can help the generators manage the price risk that they're facing. So this creates resilience. And then the other reserves that we have, but which we would use only in conditions we are very unlikely to reach, would be those necessary strategic reserves.
That's the one that Minister Tan See Leng was speaking about a few weeks ago, about the fact that we have a few months of fuel reserves left.
Well, I suspect so. I mean, in the conversations, I don't think they separated the two. But the point is that floating around the economy and any economy at any given time, there's pockets of reserves here, there and everywhere. And so it's important. I think the core message that was presented during those announcements was actually that we need to hunker down. And that phrase is very interesting and it's a very relevant term. We need to be mindful. We're at the front end of a shock that is going to have a long-term impact. There's no movement back to where we were 6 to 8 weeks ago. There's political choices which can be changed. And imagine an ideal world. We just undo everything politically. We can't undo the physical damage. And so even if we were to do that, we're still in a state of disruption. So the messaging that came out is really, be prepared. We're going to be facing different conditions. There's none of this which points towards lower prices. We don't know how high these prices will move to, but if it was cheaper to purchase from places other than Qatar, we would naturally have done so anyway. Everything's pointing in that direction. And on top of that, the meta message is one of 20% of the world's supply of key fuels disrupted. This is not a trivial quantity. This is significant. And when we then think, what might that mean for us? There's nothing about that which says, okay, it's not a major problem. It's like a simple thing. We can just pause and relax and wait. Now, the opposite messaging really comes out. It's like, this really is significant. And we're 95% exposed to natural gas. And for our transportation fleet, we're not yet at a point of being electrified. And even if we were, that electricity comes 95% from natural gas. And so there's no immunity to those problems. And so the importance of bringing a conversation around reserves to the table is really to help alleviate concern amongst businesses and residents within Singapore that there's no problem today. Now, we don't know how easy it is to replace the supply, and we've seen conversations between the leaders of Singapore and Australia to try to put in place some mechanisms to ensure that we have continuity of LNG. They are likely to come at a higher price too, but there's no immediate concerns. We're really just looking at price pressure.
So we are told that this Middle East crisis is sort of an oil crisis for the rest of the world in general. But we're also told that Singapore runs 95% on natural gas, as you've mentioned just now. So could you explain maybe the difference and the invisible string that ties the price of crude oil to that of natural gas that we use to power electricity and our air cons? Why does an oil shock automatically cause our electricity tariffs to jump?
So the tie, we'll maybe think about those two things in two separate parts, but the tie between oil and gas, it's almost a basic geological feature in many ways, and historically it's been because of this. So quite often oil and gas come in what's known as an associated field. And so you drill for oil, and many oil companies over the years, they go into deep sea exploration or many other places, and they're seeking oil. And when you drill into the oil well, often at the top of the well is this layer of gas, which is just there and available. And quite often it's not of great demand for the oil companies. And so you see images of refineries that flare the natural gas. They just burn it off because it's almost like a nuisance. It's in the way for them to get the oil. But stepping back from that, oil and gas quite typically come together. And so everything that's involved in the cost of producing one is automatically incurred in the cost of producing another one. And so for that reason, there is a tie. There's a natural, mechanical, and scientific tie, historically. And I say historically because in recent years, we have learned new ways to extract gas from, say, shale plays under the ground, and it doesn't have to be associated with oil.
But Malaysia and Indonesia are our main suppliers. Maybe you could also explain to us then, from a layman point of view, why is it that it would actually be pegged to the price of oil then?
So we obtain our natural gas from a bunch of different places. We have existing supply from Australia. We have historically taken around 20 to 30% from Qatar. And so whilst we do have supplies that may come from other countries as well, which also include as far away as the United States as it happens, but also within the region, the reality is we take a portfolio of prices, and with Qatar, for example, historically being in that 20 to 30% category, then in Qatari energy prices, there is an oil and gas connection. So there's no escaping that. And then if we're obtaining gas from locations where there may be not oil producers per se, but they can still provide gas, those countries, when exporting gas onto the global market, will look towards the global price to set the price at which they actually export. And the global market condition still correlates oil and gas prices very highly. And so, if you're Malaysia or somewhere looking to sell gas, the first question you might ask is, why would I charge a very different price from the global price? Because there's a global market that's willing to pay, say, $100 for something. I could perhaps sell it for a lower number, but $100 is nice. Why not let me just take a fraction off of that? And so I would maybe do a discount off against an international rate in order to make sure that I do sell what I have to sell quickly, but don't lose out on money that I might take.
It's a global demand and actually meeting market prices and the global demand. We're also fighting with global demand as well. Okay. And now let's look at the open electricity market, right? Back in 2021, there was this global energy spike with the Ukraine war, and independent retailers in Singapore, there were a couple and several of them that went bust and they exited the market because they couldn't handle the wholesale prices. And now we're seeing this current geopolitical volatility. Are we at risk of another wave of OEM retailers collapsing then?
I would not like to say yes, but I would have to admit that we're facing a very challenging context. The situation several years ago was actually quite different still. We had a sustained crunch on the natural gas market that was occurring through European demand in the face of extreme seasonal weather conditions that was then reinforced by a shift in China towards natural gas as they tried to escape dependence on coal. And this again squeezed the markets, and they also had some kind of extreme weather conditions. And then we ended up with this additional pressure from the Russia-Ukraine crisis, and that just absolutely disrupted and demolished even the flow of natural gas and the availability towards the global market. So there was a conflation of issues in and around that period. And, I think had played out in various different ways was that the retailers at the time had become more trusting in the wholesale and spot market prices of the fuels which they were using. And as and when those international prices began to spike and they were dependent on those international prices, they had no choice but to absorb those. And for many of the retailers at the time, they set a long-term agreement with their customers to provide electricity at a fixed price. And they were purchasing fuel from the spot market, which was considerably larger, like not just percentages, but multiples of times larger. And it just became clearly unprofitable very quickly. And so this is why we saw sudden exits in the retailers. These were companies that were not as well positioned for price spikes. This is why in the months and years following this, we had changes in the rules for electricity retailers to encourage them to secure the fuel with a 24-month ahead rolling window in mind so that they could actually be better prepared for shocks, because they know for sure that they have at least 80% of their expected future electricity paid for at a certain price. So the cost of producing the electricity they could easily and confidently compare against the revenue they got from the rates that the customers were paying. And so that's the condition we're in right now. We don't have as much unpredictability for the retailers as we did back then.
You mentioned that the OEM retailers currently hedge for 2 years on a consistent basis. Why is it that they are raising prices these days? That the private retailers have actually upped their prices now? I mean, is this a justified thing?
I think there's nothing about this which says costs will stay the same as they were 6 weeks ago, 8 weeks ago. And why is that relevant now if they're preparing for a 2-year future? Well, it's because they prepare 80% of that on a 2-year future rolling basis, and the other 20% or so, depending on the company's individual strategy, will be purchases of fuel from the spot market. So they face the price which is on gas today, that literally the one you see in the commodity markets today, and those are spiking. So as those are increasing, there's a proportion of the business which is having to pay more money in order to produce electricity. Okay. Now, how significant are those impacts? Well, they're not as significant as they were in 2022. Then we saw the price go up by, many times. It was like 30 times and things like this in periods. Whereas for gas recently, it's more like 2 to 3 times, and it's moving up and down. It's extreme. It's enough for a business that will operate on margins that are probably in single-digit percentages or low double-digit percentages to suddenly really feel an impact. So is it fair? Is it explainable? Is it rational that a company should be facing higher costs to produce electricity? Yeah, it follows. We don't know exactly what percentage, but we know it's not a small number, but it's not everything. Can we realistically predict that this is going to be a sustained duration event? That's the other part of this. So when the retailers are offering contracts to the market at the moment, so if you're going into the OEM and you're looking for an opportunity, what the retailer provides is an expectation of what they think the price will be over the next 2 years. And then they purchase on that basis and they set the price on that basis. And it needs to be fair. It needs to be fair on the basis of what the tariff rate might do. Because if the tariff comes down rapidly, then any contract you're in, if your contract is much higher than the tariff rate, you'll be asking whether or not you should escape that contract. And the retailer needs to position on those things. Is what do you think the tariff is going to be doing over the next 2 years, as well as what do I think my costs of business are going to be doing over the next 2 years, and so on. But to that expectation, given the physical supply disruption, we have an unambiguous context that we either rebuild infrastructure at a cost of hundreds of millions to billions globally, and that will take time, or we transfer to other countries that can scale up supply, but weren't scaling up that supply previously for a combination of decarbonization efforts nowadays, but also because maybe they just weren't cheap enough. And so neither of these conditions point towards any retailer or person within this market getting back to the same price point as 2 months ago. Everything hints at a higher price. Then the question which follows is, well, how much higher a price should we be facing? And that's a very difficult one to answer. Over the years, during periods of disruption, we've seen oil and gas prices move by very large percentages. And they do so on the basis of speculation as well.
And on inflation, right? So energy is this baseline cost for everything in Singapore. When we see a sustained spike in global energy prices like what we're seeing now, what's the typical time lag before it hits the rest of the economy?
So for things like the electricity and gas rates that we face, the economy, at least within Singapore, we tend to base them around a sort of roughly 2.5 month window. And so within the last 2.5 months, there'll be a question around what was it that the companies producing energy for the end customers needed to actually pay to do so. It's not a hypothetical question. It's just a factual observation of what happened. And then we trace that out. And from that, we get an understanding of what the fair cost of electricity should be moving forward. So the tariff is intended to reflect that kind of a condition. And we've seen the recent tariff revision, which reflects those very obvious impacts, but only since February the 28th, which is much smaller than that 2.5 month window. One thing, I'm trying to think about the timing of the impacts, right? So one thing is there's a delayed impact on things like electricity and gas prices because we need to wait until the end of a quarter, and that quarter will determine on the basis of everything that happened within the 3 months leading up to the end of that period, right? So April covers all the way back to January. So things that we're seeing from today onwards, they won't impact our energy prices as end consumers for another 3 months in the next tariff revision. So that's one thing. We can see if you or I were on a time of day pricing tariff, like some households can buy into this, many businesses do, we will see that the wholesale electricity prices have been higher and they move around, and we see that in real time. And then if you are a business, you will be instantly questioning, can I absorb this? Is this a week? Is this something longer? And then you may instantly change the prices of the goods which you sell in order to reflect the changed costs of production. So there'll be some pressure straight away. Then there's going to be the other part, which is going to be this longer term impact. Our cost of living for the energy base, and it is a base, it's connected with everything we do, that will creep up. People won't feel some of that until 3 months later. So we've just passed through the revision to the tariff. And then we're now talking about an impact which is stretching into global supply chains. And so the fuels which were being produced, some of them are moving from one place to another, and there may be some uncertainty about how much arrives where and at what cost. And some of that will be known by some of that will become apparent through time, but we're not going to learn the true depths of all of that for quite a period of time. And it's going to be a complicated problem because we're really talking about a core quantity of fuels which supports all transportation. A lot of natural gas goes into power production as well. So we're talking about major power sector impacts. The oil is in the transportation side primarily. So there's impacts which will raise the cost of doing things like moving anything. And so this is potentially core inflation. And how much of that we might see and when we might see that, again, it's just going to be a slow process. But what history tells us is that we can probably expect to see that, and it may not be trivial. In previous episodes of global oil market uncertainty especially, they've filtered through to periods of recession that have hit some countries, and they hit some countries harder than others. And resilience will be then a combination of how quickly and how concretely we secure supply for the things which keep us going as an economy. Now, Singapore's very well positioned. We have an economy that is very strong at the moment. We have a currency which is very strong, and we have taken early and committed steps to creating supply chain resilience, at least in the near term. We're also quite small, and so other countries will be coming to the table trying to secure their own supply, and they will have greater bargaining power to do so. So whether that results in negative impacts for us in the future is something also to be mindful of.
But say, for instance, if the war stops tomorrow, will we see prices reverting faster? Or why wouldn't we see prices reverting to normal faster than when the war started?
Yeah, I mean, that's a very timely question because even as we're going into this podcast, there's discussions, announcements from Iran around the probability of reopening the Strait of Hormuz, but the cost of a toll, which will be charged on to people, suggesting that within at least the past hour or two, we can have a changed expectation around future market conditions. And the reality is we're seeing a lot of rhetoric being deployed from many different quarters. Some will be true, some will be not quite as true, and it's difficult to know exactly what the true final landing with everything here will be. The way that I perceive it at the moment is that we had a conflict which emerged between three parties on two sides, which has now just expanded into something different. And despite what happens between conversations between Iran and the US, there's increasing evidence that other things are going to persist in the region. So then that leads us back to what we care about here, which is, what does this all mean about the reversibility of prices? Well, it means that the disruption to trade routes is likely to continue in some fashion, at least at a higher cost, which by itself tells you that reversibility. Now, if there's a toll, the toll is not going to be negative. It's going to be positive. It's going to make us pay extra money. And I haven't seen any announcement on what that might be, but the conversation is now there. So that would work against reversibility quite heavily. There's still going to be, I think, military activities within the region. And again, they would just create risk and uncertainty that shippers and insurers of logistics fleets won't be comfortable accepting. And that will create a need to take different transportation routes, and that pushes the price up. It certainly doesn't push it down. So those two routes don't get it down. And again, going all the way backwards, we've seen missile strikes and physical damage on major supply infrastructure. It's impossible for that to be undone instantly. It takes minimally months, realistically years.
Which is also why when we had the announcement of the latest tariffs for electricity, we were told to brace for even higher prices in the quarters ahead. Now, back home, let's go back home again to the transportation. Many drivers look at $3 petrol and they think, I need to switch to an electric vehicle, perhaps. But given how our grid is powered, and we're also seeing high electricity prices, do you think that EV owners actually insulated from these fuel shocks? What do you think is greater or the lesser evil, fuel or electricity then?
Yeah, in a time like this, we suddenly move towards a very short-term mode of thinking. Well, the pump price has gone up and it's gone up significantly. What should this mean for me? And, truthfully, we want to make the transition to EVs for multiple reasons. And making the transition to an EV is sensible on the basis of the energy transition, our 2050, 2060 decarbonization efforts, and whichever year we want to do, whichever sector. So it kind of makes sense. And resilience within a power system can be bolstered through electrification. This is a common thing that most economies buy into. And towards that end, I'm optimistic that electrification of the vehicle fleet remains a good idea. But in the near term, if I do a lot of driving and I face the pump price and I'm just about to change my vehicle, which direction should I go? So the trouble with the electric vehicle is that it depends upon the electricity. I think actually one of my earliest appearances on radio here was just to make that unfortunate quote. I was asked the question, the problem with electric vehicles is they depend upon electricity. And it's a very obvious thing, but it's not easy to sort of calibrate what that really means. Electricity in Singapore is not just something you take from a plug, whether it's a clever plug that you put into a car or just from the wall. It's natural gas. It's almost entirely natural gas. So if you go from a petrol and combustion engine-based vehicle to an electric vehicle today, you're changing the nature of the problem slightly, but not massively. So, if your question is, can I escape the influence of the energy crisis through my transport by shifting from petrol to EV? It will have probably some benefit because gas and oil are operating in different ways, and the shocks to gas are not quite so severe as the shocks to oil on the global market. But within the local context, anything that impacts gas is going to filter directly through to the electricity. So it's not an immunity, but it probably is a reasonably sensible choice. especially if you pair it against that need to support the government's efforts to decarbonize. We want to have electric vehicles because once we get to a low-carbon power supply, the electric vehicle is definitely the better choice.
Okay, it depends on the sources of electricity.
Correct.
Then it's better to get an EV. I mean, notwithstanding the types of models and how modern and how technological changes to the battery, etc. That's another podcast. Okay, but does this sort of geopolitical volatility accelerate Singapore's need to transition to green energy then? We've been hearing a lot about nuclear.
Yes.
So does it make it harder? And if it's harder, what kind of challenges do you see?
Nuclear is a very sensitive subject. If we're talking about that one specifically, like the choices we're exploring for low carbon solutions have been multiple, and our understanding, whichever direction we look, are that they're tricky. If it's low carbon electricity that's created through renewable facilities overseas and we import it, the mechanisms are not there for that. If it's geothermal, we don't know how much we've got locally. If it's local solar, where do we put it? We're facing problems. So if we then step back and say, look, if you put aside public concern based on very legitimate experiences and observation of nuclear disasters in recent years, why would you do that, first of all? That's a good question. Modern nuclear technology is not the same as historic nuclear technology. The risks associated with them are not the same. There's decades of work that's been taken to make sure that the engineering doesn't allow you to reach those same points. So things that we see, for example, with Fukushima, almost impossible to happen with the more modern technologies. Cost effectiveness is maybe a different question, but again, let's just separate that for a moment. Like, put the money aside. The benefits with things like nuclear is that they create a stable baseload supply of energy. Once you switch it on, it just keeps on coming. And so if you can actually trust that wherever it is, it cannot create any harmful impact to you or to the environment, and that all of the uranium that would need to be used to power it can be disposed of very, very safely, like no risk to anybody whatsoever.
For a very long time, right?
For a very long time, yes. But it suddenly becomes a very intriguing proposition because we can do that potentially within our border. We could do it with trusted neighbors. It doesn't necessarily need to be in a zone that would feel uncomfortable for us, but it would provide access to energy that is at a stable price. We don't face uncertainties in the prices anymore. Well, a little, but not as much. Uranium prices become relevant at that point, but you have a low carbon solution. And so, these things are quite attractive to us, and it's just constant supply. So you don't have to worry as much about knowing where I get the electricity from during different times of the day, which is a big problem. Like, solar panels are wonderful when the sun shines, and when there's interruption in sunshine, not so useful. And so you get this sort of sporadic nature of supply throughout the day, which you can then balance off with another technology like a battery. But then you get increasingly complicated market solutions. So, I think that's the point, that if we separate ourselves from the things that we believe to understand based on historic technologies that would cause us to be concerned about nuclear, then we can see that there are very intriguing properties, desirable even in very many ways. And then if we can open up a narrative and a conversation within society, and there's been recent calls for additional research by the government in this area, but if we can open up that narrative to at least explore what modern nuclear might mean and how much correlation it really has with those things that we're fearful of, and then at the same time begin to extend the work and efforts to build capacity through Singapore, maybe not so that we can deploy it ourselves, but at least so that we can help other countries within the ASEAN region that may be looking to deploy it in the best possible way. All of this makes a lot of sense. So I think that's the reality.
Well, that's a wrap for In Your Opinion. I'm Lynda Hong. Thanks, David, for your insights.
My pleasure. Thank you.
You can email us your thoughts on this issue. Also, if you'd like to read ST articles or opinion columns, these links can be found in our podcast show notes. This episode is edited by Hadiul Rahim. Thanks for listening.
Send your feedback to podcast@sph.com.sg. Find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or within our Straits Times app. Thanks for listening.